also received oral as well as written submissions from over 200 stakeholders, and these include operators, bus as well as taxi associations, local governments, provincial government departments, the National Department of Transport, academics, civil society organizations, as well as commuters. To promote transparency in the process, all public hearings were open to all stakeholders, and the proceedings were streamed live on the Commission's YouTube channel. In addition, all the transcripts for the public hearings are available on the Commission's website. The Commission considered all these submissions and formulated preliminary findings and recommendations. So these preliminary findings and recommendations, as formulated by the Commission, were tested with some of the stakeholders. The Commission organized a workshop with government stakeholders, which included the National Department of Transport, provincial regulatory authorities, metros or municipalities, as well as municipalities in June 2019. The purpose of the workshop was to solicit views on the preliminary findings and recommendations and assess the practicalities of implementing the preliminary recommendations. As you will notice in the Commissioner's address that will follow soon, the Commission decided to subdivide the publication of the draft report for public comments into two parts. So the main report focuses on the traditional markets, being minibus taxis, bus and rail, and the second report has specific focus on e-hailing and meter taxi services. So before I hand over to the Commissioner who will present the provisional findings and recommendations, I would like to acknowledge and thank the team involved in this inquiry for their hard work as well as dedication throughout this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. Thank you very much. Over to you, Commissioner.
Thank you very much, Sipho and colleagues, members of the media, stakeholders. As my colleague, Mr. Majenge, has indicated, we are here today to present provisional findings of the market inquiry into public transport. You have in your pack a summary of these findings. I am, as I speak, going to refer to this summary from time to time, but in the interest of time, I'm also going to launch straight into some of the deliberations and debates that took place within the inquiry process with the aim of launching into recommendations. So just a bit of a background, and you will find this on page 1 of the report. On 10 May 2017, the Commission, in exercising its powers under Section 43B of the Competition Act, published a notice that it would conduct a market inquiry into land-based public passenger transport sector. The terms of reference as required were also published on the same day in the Government Gazette. The Commission identified public passenger transport sector to include road and rail-based passenger transport, and these were further divided into specific modes of transport, such as buses, taxis, as well as what we now call e-hailing and metered taxis. So we will be talking about all of these modes of transport today. The inquiry was initiated as a result of a number of complaints we received from stakeholders. The one group of stakeholders was complaining about subsidies, so a lot of minibus taxis were complaining about subsidies that bus and other modes were receiving, which they considered to be unfair, and were calling for a level playing field. Another set of complaints came from metered taxis, who were complaining that the entry of e-hailing service companies in South Africa was not accompanied by regulation. So the regulation that was applicable to them was not applied to these e-hailing services, again affecting the level playing field. We acknowledged from the very beginning that there was a lot of policy issues that were intersecting with competition issues in this case, and throughout the conduct of the inquiry we have interfaced and interacted with transport authorities, particularly the National Department of Transport, to make sure that firstly we just understand what is going on in that sector, but to also make sure that we keep them on board. It was clear, however, that there were grounds to start a market inquiry. We believed that there were features or a combination of features in this market that were distorting or inhibiting competition, which is a jurisdictional requirement for our involvement or intervention. I should also mention that besides all of these technical requirements that enabled us to look into public transport, we ourselves consider public transport as a priority. It is a very important sector. And the background research showed, and you will see the results of this again in that page 1, that over 20% for most commuters, the majority of people in South Africa, they spend more than 20% of their income on public transport. So it is quite a crucial sector by any means. The terms of reference identified the central role of public transport in providing meaningful mobility for most people. The terms of reference identified the following broad themes, and you find them again in paragraph 5 on page 1. First issue was the price setting. So we had to analyze the various price setting mechanisms. The second issue was price regulation, examining which regulations were applicable on prices and whether these were being implemented. Third issue was the route allocation, which entailed looking at things like licensing, entry, and assessing the impact of these regulations. The fourth issue was subsidies. So looking at how these were impacting on a particular mode, but also intermodal, as between different modes of transport. The fifth issue was transport planning. As you know, that public transport involves a very high level, or it requires a very high level of planning. So we would look at this, and also, whether the available space for competition was in fact utilized. And lastly, the terms of reference highlighted the need for us to assess transformation issues, including ownership patterns in the sector. So, as my colleague has indicated, we've undertaken a very thorough process of consultations and hearings to make sure that we have a fair process. This step today is a further enhancement of fairness in that process, in that we are publishing these. These are not final recommendations or even findings. These are provisional for public comment. So, however upset you may be, just remember that you still have an opportunity to influence the process. So we invite stakeholders to make recommendations, and that rings like my phone, so I was wondering what happened between me switching it off and now. So the submissions are due by 31st March, so there is a little over a month for these submissions, and we hope to finalize the inquiry soon thereafter, obviously depending on the volume of and complexity of the submissions we receive. Just to now launch into the issues that arose within the inquiry itself. What is striking about the South African public transport system, and it was also clear in the inquiry process, was the critical role played by minibus taxis. If you like, the minibus taxis are the core of our public transport system, transporting just over 66% of commuters. And so whatever discussion that one has in this area, one has to think about the role that minibus taxis currently play, because you can only talk about the future, when you acknowledge the present. And then I'll talk some more about the implication of this. The bus constitute about 23%, 23.6 to be exact, and rail 9.9%. One of the issues, complexities, is then the issue of subsidies. So in other words, given this split of who provides the service, how then does government subsidize? What complicates the subsidy discussion in the case of South Africa is the spatial planning, the result of our history, in that we know that the majority of the population was placed in faraway taxis. So in large cities, they are found in the townships, which tend to be distant away from places of work and where most services are provided. Rural communities, there is a history there of inadequate availability of public transport. I'm saying that this compounds the subsidy question. What we found is that the system is highly fragmented with minimum coordination. There is no formalized policy, although I should acknowledge that the Department of Transport is in the process of developing this policy. Now, subsidies are not linked to ridership. As I have indicated, minibus taxis accounting for over 66%, they receive about 1% of the subsidy through taxi recapitalization. And in fact, the bulk of the subsidy, just about 40%, if I've got my numbers right, goes to rail, towards rail, so metro rail, for whether it's the CAPEX and operational budget. As I've said, that is transporting just less than 10% of people. There are further distortions there. Some of them are highlighted in the report. You will appreciate that by its nature, our rail network is limited currently. So if you are subsidizing rail, you are essentially subsidizing largely Cape Town. I think that's where you have the largest population being transported by rail, followed by Gauteng, and then there would be a little bit of KZN and even a smaller bit of Eastern Cape, if you talk about daily commuting. So that's where that 40% goes to, because that's where there's a rail commuter service. So in other words, this is where our subsidies are directed towards. This is not me speaking now, it's the numbers. There is some subsidy that's provided towards the bus system, but that's that's also, I mean, if you look at what goes towards rail. Thanks, Bake. So the bus subsidy here with all sorts of grants would be something like 20%. And this would be largely the subsidies that are provided by provincial governments, the integrated public transport systems that you find in various towns. We sometimes call it PRT, but I understand that that's not the right word because it's meant to integrate all the other modes. But you know, it's largely being directed towards buses if you look at Tshwane, Johannesburg, Cape Town. So that's what would account for that 20%. So even without talking about increasing the amount of subsidies, it is clear that subsidies are distorted. I'm not saying resolving the matter is simple. I mean, I feel for the Department of Transport who must do this policy, because clearly there is a distortion. It does affect competition, the intermodal competition. So one has to be sympathetic to the minibus taxis because they cannot compete effectively with the other modes given these distortions. It's also clear that the subsidy is not responsive to conditions. So for example, rural areas with gravel roads, clearly it's going to be more expensive to maintain your transport system there just because of the infrastructure. So when you're thinking about subsidy to those places, you also have to take those things into account. I must say that I raise all of these challenges with the subsidies, knowing how complex resolving them is going to be. But also I should acknowledge that there are pockets where the subsidies targeted have worked very well. have worked very well, providing a reliable service. I think in Mpumalanga is one example that gets mentioned all the time, there where you can see the impact of transport subsidy. So within the system, there are pockets of excellence that one can learn from. So one of the issues is whether subsidies support integration, and I'm going to come back to this issue of integration because it's quite important, because public transport is a system. We learned this from the experts in this area, that it's a system. Now the issue is whether your subsidy promotes a system, or you just have these individual opportunistic traders, you know, who find a route in an opportunity, a new settlement has sprung up, then they open a quick taxi rank and operate there. That's opportunistic. That's not integration, you know. So there is those questions. And also we have to acknowledge that the ridership, even though the ridership of taxis is so high, it seems that the low ones, like Metro Rail, is on the decline. It's not increasing, it's on the decline. If anything, the people who are quickest to serve new areas is the taxis. They are the ones who move in quickly to new settlements and fill the gap. With buses, there is an issue that has been raised with us that sometimes the subsidies are towards outdated routes. There are issues around quality, you know, wrong corridors selected, and the costs and value for money in this, especially the buses. This issue has been raised quite a lot during the inquiry, and you'll find it in the report. Just whilst I'm still on buses, there is also this practice of giving contracts at a provincial level to various bus operators and they will have de facto monopolies in various routes. One of the things that has happened is that there has been an effective moratorium into new contracts being issued since about 2000, entrenching the incumbents. And of course, there were good reasons. There were reasons provided for this. One of which is that it was clear that if you just use the usual public procurement, which is what the provincial governments do, you use the current public procurement system, the price of those subsidies is likely to go up. The cost is likely to go up. And so I think that there was a concern that if you open them up, the cost will go up. Of course, this entrenches the dominant operators that are there. You know the names of these dominant operators because they exist in each metro, at least. You have them. In rural areas, you also find them there. They are well known. Of course, there are issues of transition as well when you change operators. You know, there are labor issues. You know, if you don't, you and licensing. The Constitution provides that this function of providing public transport is a concurrent, there's a concurrent jurisdiction between the national and provincial government. And the Department of Transport in its 1996 white paper indicated that land passenger transportation should be carried out, the planning should be carried out in an integrated fashion, covering all modes, and that this should be done at the lowest possible level. So this is acknowledged, because you will appreciate that where that is coming from, because a lot of transportation, commuter transportation, takes place within a municipality. There are exceptions to this, of course. I mean, if you look at an integrated city region like Gauteng, there's probably a lot of inter-municipal transportation that takes place. But this doesn't detract from the trend which leads to this principle of devolution, that for an effective planning to take place, it must take place at lower levels. So I'm just saying that lower levels doesn't exclude the province, because it may make sense, at least as far as we are concerned, to look at provincial planning. This theme was carried through in the Land Transport Act, and I'm going to come and talk about it when I talk about recommendations, because it's quite an important and potentially contentious issue. But we are saying to the authorities, however contentious it might be, it's got to be tackled. It's got to be decided exactly who has the responsibilities to plan and who has the resources to provide subsidies for an effective public transport system. There is the one issue. There are many issues, so I'm just touching on a few things. You'll find them in our report. There is one issue I want to highlight as well, because it's crucial for public transport, and that is the issue of safety. Safety of commuters, first and foremost, the communities that use public transport, but also safety of operators and their employees. This is one of the biggest challenges to public transportation, to an effective public transport in South Africa. You see, when you provide competition, you don't want to be killed for providing competition. That should not be the cost you pay for being a competitor. But unfortunately in South Africa, that in certain instances is still the case. And consumers, commuters in this case, should also not have to put their lives at risk just because they have used a competing public transport provider. It's a complex issue again, and we deal with it in our recommendations. It's an issue it's an issue everywhere. It's an issue for trains. You know, we know they are getting bent down, and there's all sorts of issues there. It's an issue for buses. We know there are certain routes where there is violence when buses try to enter. It's an issue for minibus taxis. We know that there is a lot of conflict over routes. It's an issue for meter taxis and e-hailing services. We also know that there have been incidents there of fatalities that seem to emanate from competition between minibus taxis and e-hailing services. So it's a huge theme when you deal, and you can't divorce it from competition, because it is competition that people seek to avoid through violence. So there is a big issue to be addressed. You know, there is a big choice to be made by the state about whether you kind of surrender this to the operators because you just cannot confront the consequences of any intervention, which could include violence. So these are the major themes which have a huge impact on how we have undertaken the inquiry and the recommendations. I'm now going to come to the recommendations themselves. As I've said, you've got the background, and much of this is simply going to be highlighting to you what's in this document as a recommendation. So you'll excuse me, I'm going to have to read. The first recommendation, which is found on page 13, paragraph 67, relates to PRASA. I didn't highlight this in the theme, but for some operators there is a big problem of a conflict of interest, or at least a perceived conflict of interest posed by PRASA owning the stations, especially Park Station, which is a huge intermodal mode in Johannesburg. That is an essential facility that cannot be replicated. There is issues around access to the station, which are a subject of a separate investigation that we've completed, and we've referred PRASA to the Competition Tribunal in this case. But even after prosecuting PRASA, there are still structural changes that are required to remove the conflict. So we are recommending here that for those who don't know, PRASA operates as a subsidiary, which is called Autopex, which operates bus services in competition with other bus operators. These are long-distance bus operators. Their buses are well-known brands. Translux, City to City, are two of their big brands. So what we are recommending is that the property business of PRASA, which currently operates as just an incorporated subsidy, should be completely separate from PRASA to eliminate this conflict. In other words, the person owning the stations must be separate from the person operating buses and trains. On 69, we deal with this issue of tenders I've mentioned at a provincial level. We're saying that these tenders inhibit competition, and the perpetual extensions should be stopped, and that provincial transport departments, as well as the national department, should consider breaking some of these contracts into smaller contracts, because right now, you get one big player with a monopoly on multiple routes. We think that to promote entry, you could break these contracts into smaller contracts. The one complexity which we have no power over is how you actually source from the providers. We don't deal with this much in our report, but it's clear that just issuing a public tender may not be enough to secure better prices. But this is an issue you have to look at the law, including all sorts of prescripts from National Treasury, because it may make sense in certain instances to negotiate. But we leave this. All we're saying is that we cannot entrench the incumbents. We've got to find a solution to those contracts. The third recommendation, which is on 70, deals with this question of integration that I referred to. We think that there is a need to modernize our transport system and to integrate it. And the things that could be that should be done in pursuit of this is the establishment of dedicated transport authorities at a provincial level. This acknowledging, I think, the broad direction of the 1996 white paper, 2006 white paper, as well as the capacity constraints in municipalities, because there are a lot of capacity constraints in a lot of municipalities, and I think that could explain the slow pace of devolution from 1996, at least, when that white paper was published. But we think that a bigger role could be played by municipalities in this respect, and that there should be a devolution of planning. I've cited the example of Gauteng. I think Gauteng is already moving towards the direction of this with the establishment of the Gauteng Transport Authority, which was set up to improve coordination and to amalgamate some of the services. There is also, to promote integration, a need for a ticketing system, an integrated ticketing system. Again, these are not new ideas. I think they are there within the DOT, and I suppose in the revised white paper, the 2017 white paper by the Department of Transport, does point towards a single ticketing system. So we would urge for the immediate implementation of that. I should add that an integrated public ticketing system is very much linked to a form of subsidy you decide, because you have to think about how the two create incentives in the entire systems, and these are policy questions we are leaving to the Department of Transport. But what we are saying is that the Department of Transport must urgently develop a devolution strategy within 12 months to guide the process. This I've raised in the context of planning, but also we raise it very sharply, as I would do below, in the context of rail transportation. We have noted and appreciate that government is currently in the process of developing a subsidy policy. We think that the policy should be promoting integration, as I have said before, and we think the best way to do this it is to allow for subsidies to be allocated to provinces, who would then decide on the most appropriate transport mode. Because if we're saying planning must be devolved, it makes sense that the subsidy must be devolved so that you also target it to this mode. We think that the existing bus subsidies should also be part of this. The problem is that you have a lot of, the system is a little bit confusing. The provinces are already kind of allocating subsidies in some instances for these buses. But the buses operate in municipal areas. And so there has been no integration there. So we think that maybe it might be better to devolve this in provinces. This doesn't mean that the provinces may not decide. I mean, there are big provinces that may decide that, for an example, another form of devolution is better, like districts in some provinces might make more sense than the entire provinces. But we're saying where planning takes place, it must be accompanied by subsidy. The two must not be divorced, because you reinforce what you want to achieve with planning with subsidies. So that it's not just any municipality that goes to National Treasury to apply for a grant that gets it. But this is part of the planning that takes place at that sphere of government. So there may be a need for sometimes systems that are already being operated by provinces by municipalities to also be integrated into provinces, or vice versa, depending on how this devolution occurs. But what is also clear is that if you must achieve a true integration, metro rail services have to be devolved also to the lower spheres of government. We think that there is a role for a national government to play insofar as you have national transportation services. This is what Shosholoza Mail, for example, does, which is to provide an intercity transport system. But for a kind of more provincialized transport system network, it makes sense for that transport to be planned there. Because you've got to plan your commuter trains, in other words, your local trains, with your buses, which are also local, as well as taxis. Now, you don't want a complicated intergovernmental, multi-sphere consultation process in order to achieve this. It makes sense that one person must do it. You control trains, you control buses, you control taxis. When I'm saying control, I don't mean you own, but you provide planning, you provide regulations, you provide subsidies. All of those tools should be available at the lower levels of government because it's inefficient when you have a breakdown of a train in KwaZulu-Natal. You don't want to be calling Johannesburg to say there's a breakdown or the signal doesn't work. There's just got to be better planning. By the way, this addresses something else, which is the inequity of this. Remember I said that you've got about 40% subsidy on rail. This subsidy, it means under the current environment, in fact, it subsidizes the richer provinces. That's what it does. It subsidizes the richer provinces because there's no rail network in poorer provinces. But if you devolve public transportation systems, these provinces can start pitching for subsidies for rail networks in their own provinces if this is the most efficient mode of transport. You see, you can't give this right only to Gauteng. You've got to give it to everybody because you're looking for the most efficient and workable transport system. Right? So, and these decisions have to be made at an appropriate level. It may well be that other provinces may say, we don't want rail, but we still want the subsidy. Because remember, you are still giving the subsidy to Cape Town. it may be fair for someone sitting in Mthatha to say, in lieu of the train subsidy you are giving in Cape Town, give me a subsidy for a taxi in Mthatha. That's equity. Right now, you can't have that equity because there's no sphere of government that is able to make this. So a CAPEX decided in Johannesburg at head office, it's a CAPEX for Cape Town, Johannesburg, by and large, if you were to break it down. That just puts those in the periphery, drives them further into the periphery. So that needs to be addressed. We think that there is also an opportunity with this integration and the ticketing system to remove cash. Also, this is not new, but there is a need to remove heavy reliance on cash because cash also leads to these problems of insecurity. So the system, we need to devise a means in which people who use public transport don't have to have cash in hand. Because as you rush in the early hours of the morning to cash public transport in South Africa, you are running a risk of being mugged because you must be carrying cash if you are going to take a ride in public transport. By and large, I'm not saying there's no ticketing system, but by and large, somewhere in the system, you are going to need cash. And we think this could be addressed. So we think that whilst the subsidy is being developed, and in order to ensure the stability, especially of commuter bus industry, the current contracts should be extended, but this should be done on a very clear short-term basis. So whilst all of these things are happening, I think just to provide for certainty, that needs to happen. Given the time required to finalize the subsidy policy, to support and empower small bus operators in the interim, we believe that the subsidy policy should prescribe the conclusion of negotiated contracts, as I've indicated, as opposed to just tenders with small bus operators. The negotiated contracts awarded to small operators should account for a minimum of 30% of all allocated contracts and progressively increase over time. So we're calling for set-asides for SMMEs, and you will appreciate that this has been a consistent theme in the Commission's approach. We think that also the minibus taxis should be subsidized. You should rather increase the taxi recap program. This is in the interim, as you are dealing with your more permanent solution. As I've said, there is an inherent equity. There is an inherent equity that must be addressed. You have to address a commuter in Mthatha in the same way you address a commuter in Cape Town. There must be an equity there. Right now, the only subsidy available for minibus taxis is taxi recap. So in the interim, you must find a space for providing for equity there. With respect to the current integrated public transport networks, or what we call the BRT implementation, we recommend that municipalities, with guidance from the Department of Transport and National Treasury, should do a review of this system. You'll see in the report, in most towns and cities, this has not worked very well. There should be a review which takes into account the long-term fiscal and financial sustainability of the system, the suitability of the model in smaller cities. This seems to be a one-size-fits-all for all sorts of cities. And crucially, I think there needs to be a model for the inclusion and participation of the minibus taxi industry. Again, this could be the easiest way to transition people towards a more subsidized system if you integrate them into that. We're not saying that all the time it is necessary to use a big bus, because this is also the myth that's being perpetuated. It may still be more efficient to use a smaller mini bus type transportation mechanism, but you've got to find a way of integrating it into the other systems and making sure the subsidy falls through the entire system. I've spoken a lot about the devolution of rail, so I will not repeat that. You'll see this in this final recommendations. The only issue to add there is that we looked very closely at the Gautrain model and compared that with metro rail services in Gauteng. And we found that there are huge inequities there as well. Gautrain, heavily subsidized, operates very differently from metro rail from a service point of view. You know, the integration point of view. Literally, there is a wall between the two departure point, even when they use the same station. There's like an embankment or some wall. So we're saying that there is no need for that. We need to break down these walls and have a single system. Trains are not meant to compete with each other. I can say that even as a competition commissioner. Trains are not meant to compete. Trains are about the efficiency of aggregating demand. So if you have two trains, both going from Johannesburg to Pretoria, that's inherently inefficient. You want a single system that's more reliable and more regular. So in other words, you'd rather have Gautrain moving between the two cities at more regular times with a lower price because you've got volumes from the other train. You know, so we have to think about that, and we think that the best way, again, consistent with our devolution recommendation, is to allow the provincial government to take over metro rail and integrate it into the Gautrain and run a single system that doesn't separate people according to class. So that's quite important. There are recommendations about operating licenses. You'll also find them here. There's a backlog in operating licenses. And we can really all call, in the context of these provincial planning authorities, call for the fast track of the issuing of these licenses. I'm going to go very quickly to e-hailing because it was a separate report, but a smaller part of this. So I've already highlighted some of the problems about regulation in e-hailing, as well as some of the violence that accompanies it. So the recommendations there are really that we should, from a regulatory point of view, maybe I should put context before I go to this recommendation. You'll find it on page 24, the provincial recommendations on the summary, executive summary. Meter taxis have an area restriction. They can only operate in a particular area. So if they pick up a passenger, they can only drop off that passenger in another area. They are not licensed to operate from there. and they must come back empty. This is the primary inefficiency that's being addressed by e-hailing services. If you talk to any one of the e-hailing service provider, they'll tell you that the biggest inefficiency we remove is the idle time. Because so that's number one. Even if they didn't have all the other innovation around technology and location, just being able to ferry people anywhere is a very, very important efficiency consideration for them. The taxis are subjected to restrictions by law on the areas where they operate. These area restrictions reduce competition, and their rationale is incompatible with the evolutionary nature of this sector. So you can do one or two things. You can say that the e-hailing services must do the same. In other words, you stifle the innovation altogether. Or you allow the meter taxis to also evolve. We are on the side of evolution. We think that you should remove the area restrictions altogether. Once a meter taxi or e-hailing operator has been granted a permit, there should no longer be operational restrictions that apply on designated areas. Meter taxis and e-hailing operators may operate nationally once granted an operating license. Once you have an operating license, this is what already is happening with e-hailing services. Are you going to stop them? You can't, we think. So allow everybody to evolve towards that. Area restrictions, more specifically designated pickup areas, we say may be justifiable in very specific circumstances where the regulators issue restricted operating licenses for a number of reasons. It could be reasons of congestion and order. So for example, at the airport, you may want to consider restrictions there because you're simply going to have a stampede. So we're not saying that, but the default position should be to remove them. You should remove them and allow the best to emerge and ferry commuters. And then there is also an issue of pricing, which is very, very important. Currently, the law, as far as meter taxis, provides for the Minister of Transport or MECs to determine the price. In most instances, in fact, almost all instances, this doesn't happen. The taxi associations determine the price. There's still some archaic law that requires them to keep a meter, that old clock, you know, that counts. This is the law. They must keep that. And it must be set, calibrated according to the price that's set by regulation. But we know that, again, this is a case of regulations that are so old and are not even being implemented. So we're saying that, again there, allow for some evolution. So the section that grants the MEC or minister the power to determine fare structure for meter taxis and for publication of these, we recommend that be done away with. That taxi operators set the price. We're not saying that they may not talk to each other. It could be associations. If they set the price too high, then they are going to lose because people will move to something else. This, by the way, also doesn't mean that there could be no independent oversight over that price setting. Right? So it's just like assuming that, for example, in the case of minibus taxis, you can set the price. That's the presumption. Taxi associations set the price themselves. If you want to have control over that price, you can have an oversight system. if you want to prevent exploitation. But the principle is that you should allow dynamism in pricing. Right? So that includes, by the way, the dynamic pricing model that e-hailing service providers do embark upon. We think this is probably the last point before I deal with the security. We think that there is a need to also empower metered taxi operators. They really have no voice in policy making. So there's just an issue of organizing them into proper national associations that can provide that voice. I think in the case of mini bus taxis, this has been done, in fact, quite well with Santaco and others that are the voice of the industry. The metered taxis voice is very weak, and so we think that a formalized structure of metered taxis will assist in this regard. Because also it's probably one sector that's facing an existential question, so they need to work together to think about technology, for example, and innovation, and how this could be done, and maybe they could then be able to ask for help once they are able to get together and determine what are these existential questions. We have looked everywhere when we were doing this market inquiry, because e-hailing is not a South African problem, uniquely South African problem. These reforms we are calling for are reforms that have already been adopted in many jurisdictions. Not without resistance. There's huge resistance. There's even violence in the most developed countries. So it's not an easy transition, but it's a transition that progressive countries are embarking upon. We say that we have no choice. It's a transition we have to face, but we have to make sure that the old industries that employ a lot of people and have a lot of our entrepreneurs, they are allowed to transition, remove the restrictions in terms of the laws, and empower them to be able to transition. We have examples in the report. There are countries that still restrict e-hailing. We have not adopted that option, but there are countries that have opted for that. There are even court decisions in other countries that have restricted the operation of e-hailing services. We reflect all of those in the report so that, in fairness, everybody can see where everyone else in the world is going. But we have a position as well as a commission that you should allow, the policymakers should allow an evolution. Lastly, to deal with violence in all of these modes of transport, we are recommending that as a unit within the police services be established to deal with public transport, more along the lines of what used to be called the railway police services, but these were restricted to railways. There is a safety problem across the public transport system. This, of course, can be, in the immediate term, be facilitated by use of private security providers. But we actually think that this is the fundamental role of South African police services, and that there should be a reporting line of that unit to the Minister of Transport, and it must be capacitated. In other words, what we are saying is that there can be no effective public transport system when commuters cannot feel safe using public transport. There can be no competitors, because for competition to take place, you need competitors. There can be no competitors who can enter effectively in markets where the price of entry could be your life. So we need to enhance competition. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Commissioner. Ladies and gentlemen, the reports have been loaded on our website, both the main report and the summaries. Now we go to the next item on today's program, which is questions and clarifications with regards to the reports and the presentations that were made here today. So I will try and make sure that each and every person whose hand is up is noted and they're able to ask their questions. I will take probably 5 at a time. I have got 2 hands now. So clearly in the first round, I'm taking 2 questions. Let me start with the lady and then come with Roy. To Roy. Your name and institution.
It's Antoinette Slavert from Rapport. Commissioner, with the evolution of the rail services, what about the rail infrastructure? The signalling, the tracks, the fencing and all of that. And then just another question on the Gautrain. When the Gautrain was developed, there was actually a very concerted effort to insulate it from Metro Rail in order to make it attractive for middle class users. Do you think that was a mistake?
Roy Cocaine from MoneyWeb. Commissioner, I'd appreciate some comment related to subsidies and the approach taken by the market inquiry. There have been so many different ministers of transport over the years. I'm not sure who actually made the comment, but I know that there was a move to away from direct subsidies of operators towards subsidies of commuters in need for transport services. Was that taken into account in this inquiry? And then just with regards to the subsidies for the taxi industry, what informed your decision to actually, in the interim, you said to go for the subsidy to be through the taxi recapitalization and not through an operational subsidy, which is available, as far as I know, for bus services and possibly rail as well? Thank you.
It's better if they are just 2 because they are complex, these issues. My colleagues will come in because they were running the inquiry. The question of direct subsidies as opposed to, direct subsidies to commuters as opposed to operators is a complex one that we deliberately left for government to decide. I can venture my opinion into it, which doesn't make it easy for them to decide. Namely that if you want a system, your subsidies must encourage integration in the system. Right? That's very important. So the target of your subsidies, if you want to build a system, they must be towards building a system. It's easier with trains, for an example, because there is the beginnings of a system. It's more complex when you have taxis, because there are many people who own taxis. So how do you get them into a system of subsidy is something that's quite complex. The issue of commuters, we have thought about it and did not conclude. Here's the difficulty. There are commuters who are disadvantaged locationally by apartheid spatial planning. So if you think about people in the townships who must travel every day, they were put into that situation. So there is an inherent inequity there. There is a, if you like, a historical problem, a burden that was placed on them. So the thinking of subsidizing individual consumers was about rectifying that historical inequity. It's targeted. It's not for everybody, because one can argue that not everybody is disadvantaged the same way. So if you think about commuters who must travel, I mean, in Gauteng, there are people who travel from outside Gauteng. There are lots of towns in Mpumalanga along the Moloto Road of commuters every day who must come to Gauteng, wake up very early hours of the morning. So there is that inequity that's inherent. How you balance this is a complex policy question that we've decided to leave to the department. This doesn't mean that people may not make submissions to us, that we must make a decision on it or a choice to recommend further on. But our wisdom so far takes us to where we are, which is to say policymakers must make a choice, because it's a matter of now, if you like, allocating public funds, where, which is a function that policymakers have to make, given all of these complex issues they have to balance, providing for a system and providing for addressing historic inequities. So, taxi recap, if you like, also they have used a shotgun approach. It's what is already existing. So if you're gonna do any immediate thing on subsidies, you're gonna do it through a taxi recap. We've debated this quite a lot internally within the commission, because a taxi recap has largely been about scrapping old taxis. It's not been a subsidy in a typical sense. It's been about getting old taxis out of the streets, and not a real empowering subsidy for people to enter and expand. So one has got to we're not saying, when we say taxi recap is as it exists now, narrowly, because one of the things we found is the interest in buying taxis is astronomical. If you look at specialized finance institutions that finance taxis, the interest they charge is such a huge barrier for these taxis to remain in the market. In fact, in one instance, we found a default of more than 40%, about 45% defaults. So that's about half people who applied for finance who cannot afford to pay for what they borrowed for. That's not sustainable. I mean, you have interest rates that are close to 30%. So it can't work like that, you know. So either you have a developmental finance institution in the proper meaning of developmental finance, or you provide direct subsidies to operators through the taxi recap. But there's some thinking required there. What the commission process does is to provide facts, undisputed facts about what's happening. This doesn't mean that once you have the facts, it's easy to decide what policy intervention to make. But it's undisputed that what we have now has got huge problem in that regard. My favorite question is this Gautrain issue. We absolutely think that it was a mistake to have a train for the middle class. We actually think it was a huge mistake. You cannot justify in a country like South Africa to subsidize the middle class and decide not to subsidize or to have less subsidies for the working class. It doesn't make sense. Part of what this report does is to confront that very same issue, that integrate this thing into one and have the same service level. The service level the middle class love, the working class also love. The safety they love in the Gautrain, the working class also love. The convenience, being on time, the working class also love that. So there is no public policy justification for this. I sometimes think it would have even been better to do that old system where you have maybe 1 or 2 coaches where you have like business class. You know, so for those who want to pay more, it's still the same train, by the way. It still takes you to the same place. Maybe you just have a little bit of a big seat, if that's really what you fancy. But for trains to be completely separate, it probably is the only country that does that. I've never seen. I mean, this is unheard of. So it was a big public policy mistake, and we're engaging with the provincial government of Gauteng as it thinks about expanding it, to say that, you know, please, you know, think about how this whole thing can be integrated. Of course, I mean, I understand the objective. The objective was to remove cars from the highways and deal with congestion. But I think that was a little short-sighted, frankly. I mean, the fact that working class people may not be driving their individual cars doesn't mean that there is no public policy problem. You know, so you may be thinking that congestion in highways, you solve it by providing middle class with transport. Well, I'm not sure about that. The infrastructure question, I'll leave it to my colleague to deal with.
Yeah, on the issue of question relating to the recommendations on the rail infrastructure, we do have recommendations relating to rail infrastructure. You will recall that the commissioner talked about the devolution of planning to provinces for public transportation. So once that devolution occurs to provinces, provinces will then be able to plan their priorities in terms of public transportation. We have a very interesting example of East London, which has a rail network that goes around the city, because that rail network was mainly for freight transportation and not passenger transportation. So, and that network is there. So one can actually create spares emanating from that rail infrastructure network, which will connect to the city. But that cannot happen because currently, because of this fragmentation of planning as well as subsidies.
We have follow-ups. Do we have any further questions before we can officially say thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen? Thanks for coming, and any interviews will be arranged through Lydia, and we'll then be able to consider them and revert back to you. There are people who have requested for one-on-ones immediately after this, we'll certainly be able to do those.
Just one point. I didn't say. You see, when you do something like this, you end up dealing mainly with problems. We've spent a significant amount of time with problems. This infrastructure question is a very big area, I think, for further consideration, because there are norms and standards on infrastructure. There could be operational requirements that may require national government to play a more significant role. You know, one doesn't want to be irresponsible and you start seeing train accidents, because you see, the difficult thing is that there is this interface with Transnet when it comes to especially rail infrastructure. So there is a case there for national norms and standards, which I think is probably what the national department is best placed for. And they have done, I think, quite well in this respect. I think if you look at our infrastructure standards, whether it is the roads, the highways, you look at, you know, we don't have train accidents as a major crisis. So you can see that the standards are working. I'm not saying there's no train accidents, but there are standards that are there, and we also should complement where complement is due. I think what we are seeing is that the infrastructure that might even be there is not utilized optimally. And so this is why we have a lot of policy-related interventions that we are calling for. But this does not mean that all things are not working. I think there's a lot. I mean, if you compare South Africa with a lot of countries of our size and wealth, you will see that we are doing well. But we have particular problems that I think needs a focused attention. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I noticed that we still have coffee and snacks outside. Thank you once again for coming.